All right, we're back. Hello, welcome to Module 8. We're going to talk about post-war California, Cold War stuff, roughly 1946 through the early 60s. But there's again, like in history, there's no hard boundaries to these times that we're talking about. It's just we're cutting it up into digestible time periods. So post-war California. So we talked a lot about the changes that that World War II rushed, upon California, the industry, the expansion of agriculture. Many of these changes become permanent because of the Cold War. So we defeat Japan, we defeat Germany, but the rise of the Soviet Union convinces many U.S. politicians and war planners that the future is going to be pretty militarized, and we're going to have to confront the Soviet Union around the world. So bases like Mather and McClellan, they stay open, they become permanent, they expand. Most of the industries remain, even if they contract a little bit, they expand in other areas. So shipbuilding contracts, but the electronics industry becomes kind of permanent in California. So this time in general, they kind of call it the golden age of capitalism. Eric Foner, he's a famous historian that writes a lot of textbooks. He says it's a period of economic expansion, stable prices, low unemployment, and a rising standard of living. So again, an economic boom coming out of the war. We are also one of two superpowers that are left standing. The Soviet Union is not known for producing fun consumer goods, but the United States is. And there's no Japan. China's been devastated. Europe's been devastated. It's only the United States that supplies these goods. So we become one of the last people standing, the supplier of these goods worldwide. Well, it leads to an economic boom. The GDP doubles between World War II and 1960, to give you an idea of the expansion. Now, granted, not everyone's able to tap into that. This is very good for the white population and white males in general, and probably less so for minority groups. But looking holistically at the country, it was very good for the country as an economy. Poverty was also reduced dramatically during this time. So let's see. Quality of life is kind of goes up for the average Americans. We're talking household appliances, air conditioners, phones, and affordable televisions. There's better access to education, better food, affordable housing, leisure activities expand. The wages that come with these expanding jobs are available to purchase all of these things. So in general, quality of life improves in the 1950s. But as we know now, looking at it historically, it's left a lot of people out, and there are gaps in that improvement. There were many housewives that felt trapped in their roles, and there was some feminist pushback in the 60s because of the 50s. So it's careful that we don't get caught up in the rhetoric of everything is great, but we're speaking conversationally. So the 50s is an economic boom. It for the West Coast is pretty much the twilight of the industrial age as we shift into a service-based economy. But you had L.A. with aircraft production, San Francisco with shipbuilding, even Seattle with the Boeing plant. All the Rocky Mountain cities benefited from this government expansion in the West. It generally, for the West in general, it was the 50s was an excellent time. So let's see, what do I want to cover? So one of the things you get out of this is an expansion of white-collar jobs. White-collar, if you're not familiar with that term, is sort of professional collared shirts, right? White-collared shirts that you're not going to get greasy, you're not going to get dirty. These are managerial positions, these are executives. This is an expansion. So if you expand things like the electronics industry, we get the creation of Silicon Valley. If you expand universities, you get these white-collar jobs. So it kind of comes hand in hand. By 1956, white-collar jobs outnumber blue-collar jobs that take up manufacturing and labor. Silicon Valley is developed. The defense industry in California is expanded. We alluded to that in the last lecture a little bit, but now it's on steroids because of the the brewing Cold War. California received over 25% of the U.S. defense spending and 42% of the Department of Defense research contracts. That's usually funneled through the universities. Our universities, even though they became like focal points of the peace movement, they were always been very involved in defense-related technologies. California universities were leading centers in technology and weapons. I said that. Lawrence Livermore Labs, which I mentioned, was a key player in the nuclear weapons industry. But during this time, we get the expansion we get our three-tiered, higher education system. This is where the California state legislation passes the master plan, creates a three-tiered system where our universities focus on research and the production of PhDs. Our state colleges like CSUS and Chico focus on liberal arts. They're the institutions that create, your teachers and your state managers, and they cap at master's degree. And your junior colleges focus on, vocational skills, associate's degrees, and also preparing other students to transfer to those other institutions. So that's kind of the three-way delineation you'll see, especially if you're a transfer student and you're looking at what college to go to next. If you want to do research, original research, you're probably going to want to go to like UC Davis or, every school specializes in something. My nephew's at University of Riverside doing crazy stuff on crystalline structures that, when you add different levels of heat, they bond differently, and for computers and jet fighters and all that kind of stuff. So he likes to do research, so he's doing that. I wanted to accumulate knowledge and teach, so I went to a state school because that is, a better platform for that. So, ponder that. Anyway, but that's where you get your California higher education structure. It's based in the 1950s. We see an expansion of agriculture, but we're really talking about the continuation of corporate agriculture. Let's see. California corporate farms are staffed with cheap Mexican and Filipino labor, but they fill stores with a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables. So California gets this reputation as being this, breadbasket area. New foods become staples in the region that previously had no access. So, for example, orange juice is marketed nationally. Orange juice, I grew up, it was always like this staple item that you'd have this bowl of cereal and a glass of milk and a glass of orange juice on the table. Now we're a little more health conscious and we always go, well, there's a lot of sugar in it. But for a while it was considered part of a healthy diet, and it is sort of marketed to America during this time. You get also the agricultural industrial complex, and this is sort of this iron triangle, each one representing a leg of industry or government, but large farms, research institutes, and chemical manufacturers, and government. And so basically farmers will want higher production, so government will fund research in the institutes. The institutes create, new fertilizers, new pesticides. The farmers buy those from, well, actually, most of those patents are taken or purchased by private industry. So then the farmers start purchasing that equipment from the private industry. The private industry then uses that money to lobby the government. The government then funds more research that benefits you see what I'm saying? The money kind of goes in this weird triangle. Anyway, confusing, but it is hard to break through, and the benefits go mostly to large farmers because this equipment is expensive, these chemicals are expensive, this research is expensive. So large corporate agricultural outfits are the ones that benefit the most. And they're also the ones that use thousands and thousands of migrant bodies in the fields. So they become enormously powerful in California, and they become major players in any discussion of water and water use. But for example, a good example is UC Davis played a huge role in this. Specialized in agricultural research, techniques, equipment, chemicals, and they are highly connected to corporate farming in California. One of the things we get that benefits farming during this time too is in the late 1930s, I think 38, we get the Central Valley Project is initiated. It's kind of a New Deal project, and it is going to be federal money for the harnessing of kind of California's wayward water, the water that comes out of the Sierras that we're not capturing. So we get a giant expansion of construction for Trinity, Shasta, Folsom, New Melones, the Friant Dam, or Friant, depending on how you pronounce it, San Luis Reservoir, Sly Park Dam on 50. All of these are built by and generally I think they're administered by the Bureau of Reclamation. They're federal projects, and they benefit the 50s quite well because there's a lag time in the construction. So they're initiated in the late 30s, but it takes the 40s to kind of build all these projects. But by the 50s, all this water is becoming available for these farms. And there was a bunch of games in trying to keep corporate farming from benefiting from it by limiting the amount of acreage you could own to get this sort of low-cost water. But they have attorneys and they have ways of greasing the palms of politicians, and I won't bore you with the details. The book goes into it a bit, but corporate farming has its way of extracting water out of these projects. But you get the California Aqueduct, the Friant Kern Canal. That's these maps. Let's see. So right there, I had some pictures of some agriculture. But there's these maps right here. One is of the reservoirs, one is of the Central Valley Project canals. I think they're interesting if you like to understand the lay of the land that you're traveling on. I mean, it may not interest you, but check them out. Just so as you travel around, you can kind of get a feel for how government projects change your landscape. And not every reservoir you see is going to be a legacy of the CVP. There was the State Water Project. There's private ones. There's all kinds of other ones too. But this was a major New Deal project that really helped California expand its agricultural output. Another trend of the 1950s you get, in large part because of this expanding industry, these expanding war jobs. You get, well, it's not only expanding war jobs, but you get the GI Bill. So soldiers that have passed through California have seen that it's a nice place, the weather's nice, so people went out to the Pacific. Millions of soldiers went through California. And that light bulb goes off. Maybe I want to live there. But also, the GI Bill provides for low income loans, and many of these men enter into home ownership for the first time. Home ownership skyrockets. It's something on the order of about 44% home ownership during the Great Depression, but by 1960s, it's like 66% of the American population owns its own home. It's pretty dramatic. And of course, people that grew up in the Depression and that insecurity of home, where they were going to live, for home ownership for them is it's a significant achievement to putting themselves at peace. So we get population growth leads to the creation of suburbs. So the primary engine driving economic growth is also the growth of suburbs. The development of suburbs creates the demands for televisions, cars, and new homes. So you get this idea of like every man needs a castle, and this castle needs the biggest TV and the biggest car in the front, the nicest car. And this is, the keeping up with the Joneses kind of thing. And it's perpetuated also by television and images on TV. The number of houses in the U.S. doubled during the 1950s. Kind of develops in the East Coast in this place called Levittown. This guy comes up with these fabrication techniques to just basically build these suburban, I don't know, they're like enclosed towns. Basically, you can build them overnight, with the right fabrications, balloon framing and things like that. So it really reshapes the country's landscape because we are a very suburban country now, as you probably already know. It looks different in Tahoe because the suburbs are sort of woven into the forest and it's a little more natural looking. But when you get down into the valley, especially if you were to get above it, and well, these pictures, here's a perfect example. I don't know why I'm telling you about it when we can literally look at pictures. But these pictures right here show you exactly what I'm talking about. That's what most neighborhoods above, if you were to fly above Sacramento, that's what most neighborhoods are. They're a product of the 1950s. Sorry as I clumsily press a bunch of buttons. So California becomes a symbol of post-war suburban lifestyle. There's a massive post-war migration to the west. Again, we talked about a lot about that sort of minority migration. Well, there's also white migration. You know, people they view California as, I don't know, we've kind of talked about it almost in every module, this place you go to make it, this place you go to have a better life. Well, this is really ramps up again after the war. California becomes the most populous state by 1962. So we've gone from this complete backwater by the gold rush in the 1850s, and by 1962, so 110 years later, the most populous state in the Union, probably the most powerful too, if you were to look at the political clout and, you know, the economics of, you know, it's a powerhouse. So one of the things you get out of this time is unfortunately a thing called white flight. You may or may not be familiar with that terminology, but as inner cities become overcrowded and packed and industries set up factories and shop, white people have the leverage and the money to sort of live outside the city in these growing suburbs. So it's this kind of biofeedback thing, whereas the more you build, the more white people take their money and exit the city and then demand their politicians create freeways, and the freeways bypass minority neighborhoods and old business districts. So the old business districts close down and they generally move out to the suburbs where the money is, and the process just perpetuates itself. And you see it all through LA. There's a reason LA is so flat, you know, and sprawly. You know, that's Folsom in California, or El Dorado Hills. Some of that is, you know, sprawl, where you can basically, you could live in Folsom and work at Intel in the big Intel building off Highway 50 and never go to Sacramento ever if you don't want. So that's the way it changes cultural patterns, changes the way our state flows. This is also happens on the East Coast, but it's also a bit different because a lot of those cities back there have done a better job, mostly because they were forced to, of going vertical. So, you know, nowhere in Sacramento, well, one or two places in downtown, but mostly you don't live in a 10-story high-rise building. You just don't need to in Sacramento. There's only a couple of them downtown, and they're too pricey for most people. But this does create what we come to understand as ghettos, the ghettoization, or barrios for Hispanics. It creates places where they're stuck, and we alluded to that in the World War II module, where, you know, people would come out to work these jobs in Hayward and Oakland, not be allowed to rent outside of black neighborhoods, and so they just become stuck. Well, this expansion in the 50s continues that process. There was a clause found recently in a HOA in El Dorado Hills about not allowing a person to sell their house to anyone who's black. It was recent. It was in the last like 8 or 10 years, and the controversy was, well, we need to strip this out. Most people are like, well, it's not enforced, it's a legacy of the past. But other people were like, well, we need to take it out on principle. It doesn't need to be in this HOA thing at all. So they were really haggling about whether it was worth it, or it was a really strange discussion. But yeah, it still existed. So, you know, we get the ghettoization and the barrioization of places in our city. And segregation. It's segregation of a different kind. It's economic segregation and sort of self-segregation. It's not imposed by the government, but it is a form of segregation. So, anyway. So a home in the suburbs, nice TV, it's the American dream. Part of this is cars, and we talked about car culture coming up in the 1920s when we talked about the 20s talk. Well, this is, now we've had, you know, 20 or 30 years of the development of cars, but this economic expansion really allows, again, just like there's first-time homeowners, there's first-time car buyers. So car culture continues to expand in California. Becomes a key part of this suburban life, because remember, it's sprawled. These suburbs are not friendly to bicycles. They're really not friendly to bus travel. The electric trains have mostly been stripped out of most cities and replaced by bus service. So it's a automobiles world in California. So this leads to an outcry for, you know, more highways, more freeways, you know, more development of infrastructure that benefits cars. It also empowers the auto manufacturers and oil companies to be very powerful in this country. So if you want to know why Chevron and Exxon and all these companies can throw their weight around, it's because we're dependent upon them because of the culture we've created, but we demanded it ourselves, and it's part of this American dream. So all these things are linked, and California is at the forefront of that. You know, we've exported that value to a lot of places, and you can kind of see the love affair with cars in California in the movie American Graffiti. You know, obviously 95% of you are too young to remember that movie. I like it. It was even before my time, but I was still close enough to it to where I like watched it, and it was made in the 70s, but it takes place in 62 in Modesto, and it's just about it's like youth culture, and it's centered around owning your car and going cruising and trying to get girls and showing off your car. And they'd all have the radio tuned to the local DJ, and they, you know, would listen to the radio, and it was sort of like Happy Days kind of thing, if you remember that show Happy Days. But it was in the Fonz, and how he was cool. He was a motorcycle guy, but it gives you an idea of that kind of lifestyle, right? And there's this idea of, you know, it's just cool to have your own car. Cool, man. And cool is a thing that, it wasn't invented by Americans. There have been other cultures that have always had notions of what's cool in their culture, but Americans definitely distilled it down and figured out what the essence is, and we've been selling cool ever since. You know, many of the things you guys don't think are cool now were once super cool. Like, I remember in high school, I played soccer, and our soccer team was going to go play in Scandinavia and the Soviet Union, and one of the tips was, you know, bring an extra suitcase full of old Levi's jeans. So you were supposed to go down to this thrift store and just buy a bunch of ratty old jeans, but they would sell for like $50 or $100 a piece there, you know, because people wanted American Levi's so bad they were willing to spend like a month's wages. So the idea was you were supposed to go there and fund your trip by like selling Levi's behind the Iron Curtain. It's really dumb. I didn't end up going, but that was one of the things that came up because cool sells, and car culture is part of that. It's a very California thing. But it leads to, you know, decentralized services. We talked before in the 1920s thing, I mentioned motels. Now you have drive-in movies, drive-in theaters. You know, there's still, in my town where I live now, there's still a drive-in you can go to. I'm probably going to take my daughters. It's more of like a museum legacy at this point, and like a, you know, a fun thing to do. It's like, we obviously have 1,000 other cultural things we can do, but there was a time when that was the thing that you did. That was the internet, right? That was the exciting thing. Although obviously the internet's not new. The internet's. So anyway, let's see what else. This also puts California in an interesting position when it comes to dependence on energy. California was an energy producer, and then once car culture really expands to its full, you know, potential, California becomes a net importer of energy from other states. And one of that is one downside of our car culture is the pollution that it generates. So California early on also got a reputation for pollution. LA, I remember my grandparents lived in Anaheim, and we'd go down there and this orange band across the horizon. This was when we thought we were better than them because we lived in Sacramento and we didn't have that. But then, of course, now we do. You know, my parents would always say, we're becoming like LA. So LA quickly felt the cut of that double-edged sword of this love affair with cars and its decentralization. Many books were, you know, immediately starting to address this. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was a good one, and it was kind of, her premise is that if we don't get a handle on the chemicals that we're releasing into our environment, one day you're going to wake up and there's not going to be any birds, because they were having problems with the shells of the eggs becoming too soft, and predators were able to kill them, and bird populations were diminishing. This happened to the California condor, and, you know, when they had to rehab the California condor back into, you know, basically viability as a population. You know, so by the early 1960s, this environmental pollution is starting to really become part of the discussion and the consciousness, and people are starting to believe that it's true, and believe that there's negative health effects. So anyway, suburbanization. Now this is a separate issue, but also probably linked in some ways to this. But television culture. We talked about Hollywood and the power of Hollywood, but TV culture also reinforced a lot of these, California, stereotypes and images. Not everything was produced in LA and Hollywood. There was a New York television industry and all that, but still a lot of that television industry, as we know now, if you're going to be on TV, you're probably going to film in LA. You're probably going to be down there. I have a friend who lives in a place called Toluca Lake, and when you drive to her house, you're just driving by these giant lots with these giant, almost like aircraft hangars that they can just manipulate towns and scenes, and you can literally, there's stars that just live in Toluca Lake because they want to walk to work. It's really strange because she's a makeup artist and she works in that industry. She just lives on a street, and probably every third house is owned by a star. And maybe they don't live there all the time, but it's like a little TV communities that are in LA. Anyway, if you choose to be like a weird stalker, you can go down there and check it out. Not really my thing. But so this television spreads consumer identity. TV is part and parcel. Let me scroll down. Some pictures of some. I took the time to pick these pictures, so we might as well talk about them. So right there's the movie drive-ins I was talking about, and the drive-up thing. These were all considered, cutting-edge things. We would flash these things. This is what made us better than the Soviets, because we had drive-in movies. But you could see that freeway expansion. American Graffiti. There's Disneyland. So take a look at Disneyland on the right next to the American Graffiti poster. Those are all orange trees in the background. Of course, that's called Orange County for a reason, right? Parking lot's huge. Disneyland's only really viable. They could only put it out in the countryside because of car culture. There's no train systems that were taking anyone out there. This is all because of cars. There's television culture. There's the ads for the TVs. This becomes kind of a keeping up with the Joneses thing. If one TV is good, well, maybe having two is better, or maybe you want just the biggest TV on the block. You see this. I don't know if you're familiar with that cartoon by Bill Burr called F is for Family. It's a little risque, a little raunchy, in terms of like its content. It works for me. I'm fine with all that, but just if you go look it up, just careful what you're getting. But the guy obsesses over having a bigger TV than his neighbor, and he's just, it takes place in the 70s, but he's still consumed with this kind of keeping up with the Joneses thing. There's a Leave It to Beaver family on the left. That's the Cleavers. I grew up with them. They were supposed to be the model family. Mom stayed home, dad went to work, the kids played on the local baseball team. It was just the way it was supposed to be, right? A little bit depressing if, you're a minority family and your mom has to work and you can't afford to be on the baseball team and you don't look like the Cleavers. So they talk about representation, right, in American culture. Well, for many decades, Hollywood and the American TV industry dictated what that representation looked like. And it was really Leave It to Beaver-ish. And it even affected white families if you didn't look like the Cleavers, if your family didn't operate like that. If your dad was an alcoholic and your mom was not cool as June Cleaver, you didn't like your own family because you weren't the Cleavers. I'm probably over exaggerating, but I think you get my point, that we often sell these images. We always talk about selling images to young girls about what women's bodies should look like. Well, we've sold images to American families about what American families should look like. This is a very California product that we've exported. On the right, you see Lone Ranger, very popular show in the 50s. Tonto on the right, actually, believe it or not, is actually played by a native, not a Native American, but a Canadian First Nations gentleman named Jay Silverheels. He only was able to get Native American parts for the next 30 years of his life. All he could ever really do was play Native American, all the way up until like CSI, where he would play like a tribal chief at a casino. Like he was typecasted all the way up until his death. But but at least it wasn't whitewashing, right? At least oftentimes during that time they would have just a white character play a a minority character in makeup. We hadn't still evolved beyond that. So let's see. Consumer culture. What do I want to talk about? Let's talk about politics. So we had a Democrat resurgence during, during the New Deal, during the Great Depression and the war. FDR was kind of an American hero in a lot of people's eyes. He got us through the war. So but the Democrat sort of legacy faded after the war. Coming into the 50s, we get, Truman kind of leads us out of the war, but we get Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower's a Republican. He's a famous general, so it's kind of hard to vote against a guy who, stormed Europe and defeated the Nazis. Although we all know the Russians defeated the Nazis, but yeah, I guess we helped like a little brother. On the left of this picture is Earl Warren. Earl Warren is a Republican. He becomes governor of California. He is basically pretty liberal. It's, we're coming out of the New Deal where you could still be conservative and you still, or not conservative, you still had sort of big government Republicans. And he was into passing legislation that, infrastructure bills and things like that. But on the right is Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is a little more traditionally conservative, and he also comes up through the Republican Party in California. So in 1952, Eisenhower is elected. This sort of takes national politics back to republicanism. We get a resurgence of conservatism in the 1950s, begin to push back against liberals by reclaiming the idea of freedom. There's this kind of notion, which I'll talk about more in my next lecture on the Cold War, but part of it is that, coming out of World War II, America, we're the land of the free, the home of the brave. We've decided that that's our motto. Hashtag freedom, right? That's what America is. It's freedom. And so ideologically, conservatives could seize that and say that they were the proponents of freedom, and that left-wing big government expansion was more in the vein of what the Soviets do and how they run their show, right? So we'll talk more about that in a minute. You get a rise of Christian conservatives who wanted a government to regulate morality, but they're also in conflict with sort of libertarian conservatives who wanted personal autonomy. So there's a rift even in conservatism. That rift's always kind of been there, but you can see it kind of play out during this time. We get the rise of Richard Nixon. Most people only know him as president, but he's a California product. He comes up through the California Republican Party. He serves as a state senator, or as a senator. Eisenhower chooses Richard Nixon as his running mate. Nixon is a staunch anti-communist senator, but he had a reputation for dishonesty, which we all saw that play itself out in the presidency, which we'll get to. Nixon helped to transform the Republican Party from the party of big business to a free market sort of conservatism focused on the forgotten man. Because remember, you need votes, and you've got to appeal to some kind of base, right? So he's part of this new conservatism, but they're also in a lot of ways trying to get away from Earl Warren's increasingly liberalization of it's Republican liberalism. He had many liberal policies that angered conservatives, and Nixon is part of this conservative push to steer the party to the right. Let's see. So 1952's election with Dwight D. Eisenhower is the first heavily televised election in USA. Remember, FDR would give those fireside chats? That's all radio. So by the time we get to 52, the amount of people that own televisions makes it worth producing advertisements and speeches on TV. So we're really starting to enter an era that really reflects the era we know, which is visual communication. But out of this era, we get what's more or less modern republicanism. Eisenhower administration brought a Republican to the White House for the first time in 20 years. He's pro-business. He's a fiscal conservative. But he kind of rejected rolling back New Deal ideas like Social Security, right? Republicans had a chance to kill some of those things, and they didn't because they knew they were popular. And it was probably going to be bad politics to do that. But he initiates a national highway system. That's a very large project. Publicly funded construction of a national highway system. Car makers, oil companies, tire companies, unions, construction companies, they all wanted the system built. So not a very fiscally conservative thing. He could have told the states, build it on your own, or he could have washed his hands of it and said that's not a conservative way forward for national infrastructure. The National Defense Education Act. In 1957, Ike signs the National Defense Education Act after Soviets put Sputnik in orbit. They beat us to space. First human object to orbit the planet, the act provided federal funds for education that emphasized defense-related knowledge. Well, guess who benefits from that? California, right? We have all those research institutes. Remember I said 44% of all the DoD's research funds go to California? Well, hello Ike, right? So national politics benefiting California. In California politics, Earl Warren served as California State Attorney from 1939 to 1949. So he gets his political chops honed in, during that time. He's governor from 1943 to 1953. He is known basically as being fairly liberal. But he evolves over time because he's also pro internment of the Japanese, so there's some evolution to his thinking. He is an opponent of the Red Scare and McCarthyism. So, that's not a very conservative position for the time. In 1953, he's eventually appointed Chief Justice of the United States, and the Warren Court, as it is known, goes on to be very liberal and a friend of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And so it is an interesting trajectory that you get this California Republican who ends up being a major civil rights hero. So, let's see. Earl Warren often softened his position on many issues over time. I said that. He opposed loyalty oaths for state employees. He did not support the House Un-American Activities Commission that investigated Hollywood, which I'll talk more about in the Red Scare lecture I'm about to give. He's replaced by Goodwin Knight when he becomes the Supreme Court Chief Justice. Goodwin Knight takes over. Knight is more of a traditional conservative, but he doesn't tinker with too many of Warren's liberal legislation. He doesn't go to roll it back, but he also doesn't pursue more of it. Knight leaves office when it looks like he's going to lose the election to another conservative Republican, William Noland, but this opens up the opportunity for California to swing back to the Democrats. So they've had their decade of Republicans. The Republicans are kind of splitting between sort of the liberal wing, the Warren wing, and the more conservative wing. This brings us to Edmund G. Brown, also known as Pat Brown. Pat Brown is the father of Jerry Brown, our current governor. Ding, 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 light bulb comes on. In 1958, Brown wins the election for governor. He brings the state under Democrat control. Brown pursues policies that reflect the modern understanding of liberalism, right? All the things are aligning where you think of like pro-union, pro-civil rights, pro-education, whatever you think of as modern liberalism is now finally kind of ensconced in California political leadership, at least on the Democrat side. Brown received strong support from unions. Brown expanded social programs. He increased taxes, very common for liberal agendas when they become into office. That's generally something that they like to pursue. He gets a lot of support from the African American community. He passes legislation to end workplace discrimination. He pushes for the creation of the Division of Fair Employment Practices. The legislation also passes the Unruh Civil Rights Act, prohibiting discrimination in business transactions, public accommodations, and public housing. This is, it's showing leadership. This is happening before these things reach the national level. So California is becoming, it's solidifying its reputation for liberalism We saw this a little bit going all the way back to Hiram Johnson, you know, where he's a Republican, but he has very left-leaning tendencies. And then, of course, you know, Earl Warren, so now Edmund G. Brown. Not only at the state level, but locally, you get local liberalism starts to rise up. Coalitions of union members, minority voters, middle-class liberals formed in many cities. Remember white flight? White flight had gone to the suburbs. Well, they're out in the counties now. So many of those sort of red voting, pro-business, sort of PTA-loving, baseball, you know, just your traditional core American values folks have now gone to the suburbs. Well, they now no longer can influence city council elections. So they become very liberal. And you see this in Berkeley, San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles. They all shift to being quite liberal. And they all pursue fair housing, fair education, equitable employment practices. They all institute these things in their cities. So despite the conservatism of the 1950s, you do by the end get a shift in California that really looks very much like what we see now in our state. So finally you're starting to see the political architecture there. Now we still had Republican governors, you know, Reagan and you know, Gray and Schwarzenegger. But you know, to be Republican in California will always require being far less conservative than the Republicans in the rest of the country. And you'll see that as we discuss some of the other, you know, political evolutions. But that's sort of where we get in the 1950s. You know, that's the start all the way through the end. I'm going to talk about the Red Scare because the Red Scare has a lot to do with why things shift from Republican to Democrat in California. But as you can see, you know, a lot of the, you know, because we keep talking about modern California, what is modern California? Much of what you see when you travel around was determined in the 50s. You know, the Upper American River Project, which I did my master's thesis on, when I started researching it, I didn't know what it was a product of. I didn't know when it was built. I just researched it. It's a product of the 1950s, right? Prior to environmental laws, they could go up in the mountains, get all the water rights that they wanted, build all the dams. They put that system in before all the backlash against that development happens in the 60s, where we fight pollution, we fight you know, tearing up the countryside, you know, our pristine areas. We start to fight all that, but it doesn't happen to the 60s. So the 50s is like this last rush of building major infrastructure projects. So anyway, kind of interesting. So hopefully that, you know, ties some things together. Let's talk about the Cold War. Yay.